No paragraphs, same cold tone. Let's go. The story sounds exaggerated when you first hear it. 20 Australians, 1 US Army division, no heavy weapons, no armored support, no air cover screaming overhead, just improvisation, a stick, a length of string, and something far more dangerous, controlled fury. On paper, the division had overwhelming superiority, thousands of personnel, layered logistics, armored mobility, integrated communications, surveillance capability, a structure designed for sustained dominance. Against that stood 20 operators moving light, carrying almost nothing that resembled conventional advantage. The outcome was never supposed to be competitive, but this was never about symmetrical warfare. The Australians understood something fundamental. Large formations rely on cohesion and tempo. Disrupt tempo, and cohesion begins to fracture. The stick and string was not literal simplicity, it represented adaptation. Fieldcraft, improvised triggering mechanisms, deception tools built from environment rather than supply chains. Where the division trusted equipment, the Australians trusted observation. Weeks before contact, they studied movement corridors, convoy spacing, radio discipline, reaction time between detection and mobilization. They mapped habits. Habits create rhythm. Rhythm creates predictability. Predictability creates openings. The first disruption was subtle. A convoy stalled in terrain it believed secure, not destroyed, stalled. Confusion rippled outward through command channels. Was it mechanical failure, terrain miscalculation? Within minutes, rerouting orders overlapped. Patrol elements adjusted positions. The Australians had not attacked strength, they had tugged at structure. A simple tension line across a narrow path redirected armored weight into unstable ground, a primitive solution exploiting modern confidence. That was the pattern. Minimal force, maximum psychological distortion. Small trigger events that forced large recalculations. The division began reacting instead of advancing. Recon units pushed forward aggressively, attempting to flush out what they assumed was a larger hostile presence. They found nothing, or rather, they found absence where resistance should have been. Empty ridgelines, abandoned observation points, signals that suggested movement without visible force. The Australians were not trying to win through confrontation. They were trying to expand uncertainty until the division could no longer trust its own scale. Night amplified the imbalance. Large formations require lighting, coordination, structured rest cycles. Small units require silence and patience. Improvised trip mechanisms redirected patrol routes. False indicators triggered defensive postures in sectors with no threat. Communication traffic increased. Increased traffic breeds noise. Noise slows clarity. By the second operational day, the division was not fighting 20 men. It was fighting the possibility of 20 men everywhere. That distinction matters. Fear of scale is more destabilizing than scale itself. The stick and string became symbolic. Low-tech leverage applied against high-tech dependence. Every time the division committed resources to a suspected contact, the Australians shifted focus elsewhere. They never presented a decisive target. They presented friction, and friction compounds. Vehicles burned fuel repositioning unnecessarily. Units lost sleep chasing shadows. Command confidence narrowed as reports contradicted one another. 20 disciplined operators cannot overpower a division head-on, but they can pull it apart if the division allows its own reactions to become predictable. Fury was present, but it was not reckless. It was controlled, focused, directed at exploiting complacency. The Australians did not rely on anger to guide them. They used it to maintain intensity. By the time Division Command realized they were being systematically manipulated, the operational tempo had collapsed. Momentum was gone, initiative had shifted, and when initiative shifts, numbers lose meaning. The division still possessed overwhelming strength, it simply no longer controlled the field. And that is how something as simple as a stick and a piece of string can begin to unravel something built on scale. By the third phase, the division's advantage had inverted into liability. Large units depend on synchronized movement, layered support, and constant communication. Once synchronization slips, scale becomes drag. The Australians understood this and began tightening pressure in precise intervals. Another convoy rerouted, another patrol redirected by a simple environmental trigger. None catastrophic, all cumulative. The division responded exactly as doctrine required. Expand perimeter security, increase reconnaissance sweeps, tighten communication cycles. Each adjustment consumed manpower. Each adjustment reduced flexibility. The Australians were not defeating firepower, they were exhausting coherence. Reports flooded command with partial sightings, shadows on ridgelines, thermal signatures that vanished before engagement, sound cues without visual confirmation. The division escalated surveillance assets, but more sensors produced more data. More data required more interpretation. Interpretation delayed action. Delay created hesitation, and hesitation in a large formation spreads faster than fear. The stick and string tactics evolved from obstruction to narrative manipulation. A simple tension trap triggered flares at the wrong time, convincing units they had been observed when they had not. A basic tripline redirected armored mass into terrain that slowed movement just enough to disrupt schedule alignment. Every minor disruption forced recalibration. Recalibration reset tempo. Reset tempo erased momentum. By now, division leadership suspected they faced a larger irregular force coordinating across sectors. That assumption drove redistribution of troops, thinning concentration where it was strongest and reinforcing where nothing was happening. The Australians anticipated that shift. They moved into the vacuum, not to engage directly, but to observe the reaction cycle tightening on itself. Controlled fury remained the difference. They were angry, yes, angry at underestimation, at institutional arrogance, but anger was contained within discipline. They did not rush opportunities. They allowed the division to overextend. Night operations became particularly costly for the larger force. Engines idled longer. Patrol rotations overlapped inefficiently. Fatigue crept into communication tone. A tired division is a reactive division. Meanwhile, 20 operators rotated rest in microcycles, conserving clarity. They operated inside silence while the division operated inside noise. The tipping point came when command initiated a concentrated sweep designed to crush the perceived insurgent network in one decisive maneuver. It was bold, it was organized, it was predictable. The Australians withdrew just beyond engagement range, leaving behind only environmental friction, minor obstacles, misleading traces, and improvised triggers that fragmented the sweep into uneven sectors. The sweep concluded without decisive contact. That absence was louder than defeat. The division had mobilized massive strength against nothing tangible. Confidence cracked not from losses, but from futility. Initiative had fully shifted. The Australians did not need to destroy the division. They needed to prove it could be steered. And once a formation realizes it is being steered by a smaller force, scale becomes psychological weight rather than strategic advantage. What remained was not battlefield devastation, but operational paralysis creeping in slow increments. The division still stood. It simply no longer dictated the rhythm of the fight. What happened next was the quiet collapse that never makes headlines, no catastrophic ambush, no single decisive explosion. Instead, systems began contradicting themselves. Orders overlapped. Patrol grids intersected inefficiently. Units reported activity in sectors that had already been cleared hours earlier. The division still possessed overwhelming combat power, but power without clarity is dormant. The Australians understood that the objective was no longer disruption, it was demonstration. They needed the division to recognize the pattern. Recognition is heavier than surprise. When surprise fades, systems recover. When recognition sets in, that you are being studied, guided, anticipated, confidence erodes at structural level. Another improvised obstruction stalled a logistics column at a narrow crossing point. Not destroyed, delayed. That delay forced a resupply recalculation. That recalculation shifted movement timelines across multiple units. A simple length of tensioned cord altered operational geometry across kilometers. The elegance was in proportion. Minimal input, maximum ripple. Division command escalated aerial reconnaissance, saturating the area with surveillance. The Australians reduced movement accordingly. Silence returned. No triggers, no signals, nothing to chase. The division's heightened alert posture burned energy against emptiness. Fuel consumption rose. Sleep cycles shortened. Communication tone sharpened. Fatigue is an amplifier. It magnifies doubt. By now the larger force was not hunting 20 operators. It was hunting uncertainty itself. That is an unwinnable objective. Fury on the Australian side hardened into precision. They did not celebrate disruption. They measured it. They watched how long it took for reaction chains to complete. They tracked how rapidly units repositioned. They noted which commanders adapted and which relied rigidly on doctrine. The stick and string were never about primitive weapons, they were about leverage. Every time the division committed disproportionate resources to minor stimuli, leverage increased. The final maneuver was almost invisible, a coordinated series of small environmental manipulations redirected movement corridors just enough to compress two battalion-level elements into overlapping terrain at the wrong time. Not a collision, not chaos, just congestion. Congestion stalled initiative entirely. For several operational hours, the division's forward momentum flatlined, and in that window the Australians withdrew beyond engagement range. Extraction was quiet, no pursuit materialized. The division could not chase what it could not define. In after-action analysis, the most troubling line read, "Enemy force strength undetermined." That uncertainty was the outcome. 20 disciplined operators had not annihilated a division. They had outmaneuvered it psychologically, logistically, rhythmically. The division remained intact, its manpower, its armor, its air support, all still formidable. But for a controlled period of time, it had been steered by minimal tools and maximum understanding. And once that truth settles in, that scale can be redirected by precision, the balance of power feels permanently altered. In the aftermath, there was no dramatic admission of defeat. Official summaries used neutral language, operational friction, environmental complications, irregular resistance. But inside internal reviews the tone was different. The division had not been beaten by superior firepower, it had been maneuvered by restraint. The most uncomfortable conclusion was simple. Every major reaction had been triggered by something minor, every escalation had been voluntary. The Australians never forced overcommitment. The division chose it, step by step, under pressure of uncertainty. That distinction reshaped the analysis. Large formations depend on clarity to justify scale. When clarity disappears, scale becomes heavy. Heavy formations consume more fuel, more coordination, more confirmation cycles. Meanwhile, 20 operators moved light, carrying nothing they could not abandon instantly. The stick and string symbolized independence from logistics, no supply chain vulnerability, no technological reliance that could be tracked or jammed, just environment and intent. In final debriefs, one senior officer reportedly summarized the experience in a way that lingered. "We were reacting to ghosts we couldn't measure." That was the true imbalance. Measurement drives modern military confidence. If something cannot be measured, its numbers, its location, its intent, it becomes strategically expensive. The Australians never presented measurable mass. They presented controlled disruption. By the final operational window, the division had shifted from aggressive maneuver posture to protective consolidation. That shift alone marked the outcome. Initiative had changed hands. The larger force was preserving itself instead of projecting strength, and projection defines dominance. When projection stops, perception shifts. Fury had fueled the Australians at the beginning, but discipline defined the end. They did not chase glory. They did not escalate into open confrontation to prove a point. They proved it already. 20 against thousands. Improvisation against infrastructure. Patience against protocol. When extraction completed, there was no battlefield littered with wreckage. The division still stood, armored and equipped. But something less visible had cracked. Confidence in automatic superiority. And that crack matters more than casualties, because once a formation understands it can be guided, slowed, fragmented by minimal tools and maximal study, it must rethink not just tactics, but identity. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Dominance is not about what you carry, it is about how well you understand what the other side depends on. 20 Australians did not destroy a division. They demonstrated that scale without adaptability is leverage waiting to be pulled, and sometimes all it takes to pull it is a stick, a piece of string, and the discipline to know exactly where to apply pressure. Years later, the event would still circulate in professional circles not as myth, but as case study. The numbers were always what drew attention first, 20 versus a division. But analysts who looked deeper stopped focusing on numbers entirely. They focused on dependency chains. The division depended on synchronized logistics, structured patrol grids, layered communication hierarchies, and constant confirmation loops. Break one link and the system compensates. Nudge several links simultaneously and compensation becomes strain. The Australians never snapped the chain. They applied tension until the chain tightened against itself. That is the distinction between destruction and manipulation. Destruction is loud and temporary, manipulation is quiet and cumulative. During final reviews, simulation teams attempted to recreate the engagement under altered conditions: more surveillance, more aggressive rules of engagement, faster response authority. The results improved marginally, but one variable remained constant. Once a large formation commits to reacting to dispersed micro-threats, its tempo becomes externally influenced. Tempo is sovereignty on a battlefield. Lose tempo and you are no longer shaping events, you are absorbing them. The Australians shaped everything without ever presenting decisive contact. Even their fury was strategic. It sharpened focus rather than clouded it. Anger can produce recklessness. Here, it produced discipline. Every improvised trigger, every redirected convoy, every misleading signal was measured. They understood escalation thresholds better than the division understood its own. When you know exactly how much pressure will provoke a certain response, you control response. By the time the operation concluded, the division's greatest strength, its size, had been converted into its greatest burden. Movement required coordination across too many layers. Adjustments required approvals across too many channels. Meanwhile, 20 operators adjusted in seconds. That agility was not technological, it was structural. Small teams do not eliminate friction, they minimize it. And minimized friction moves faster than institutional momentum. The final takeaway was not humiliation, it was warning. Any force, no matter how advanced, becomes vulnerable the moment it assumes scale guarantees dominance. Scale magnifies power, yes, but it also magnifies rigidity. The Australians proved that rigidity can be redirected with almost nothing tangible. A stick and a piece of string were symbols of independence from complexity. They represented the ability to create effect without creating trace. In modern conflict, that might be the most dangerous capability of all, because when a massive formation realizes it has been steered by something it cannot even quantify, it must confront a new reality. Superiority is conditional, and once that condition is exposed, the battlefield no longer belongs automatically to the biggest force. It belongs to the one thinking ahead, and that is where the real conclusion settles in. The division did not lose men in catastrophic numbers. It did not surrender territory in dramatic fashion. It lost something less visible and more consequential: automatic authority over the pace of engagement. From the first improvised trigger to the final quiet withdrawal, the Australians dictated rhythm. They decided when confusion would spike and when silence would fall. They determined which sectors felt pressure and which felt abandonment. The division possessed armor, artillery, air support, layered intelligence, but it never possessed initiative. Initiative had shifted the moment its first reaction followed a pattern already predicted. That is the invisible turning point in any asymmetrical conflict. Once a larger force begins operating inside expectations defined by a smaller one, it is no longer leading, it is following. The symbolism of the stick and string endured because it stripped the narrative down to fundamentals. Technology amplifies capability, it does not replace awareness. Infrastructure increases resilience, it does not replace adaptability. The Australians weaponized simplicity against complexity. They demonstrated that when you are not burdened by scale, you can move through its gaps. And scale always has gaps, created by coordination, by policy, by doctrine written for predictability rather than improvisation. In final internal reflections, the harshest realization was this: nothing the division did was tactically wrong. It followed procedure, it escalated responsibly, it committed resources where signals suggested threat, and that was precisely why it could be guided. Doctrine is powerful, doctrine is also readable. The Australians read it line by line without ever seeing the manual. By the time the operational window closed, the message was undeniable. 20 disciplined operators had demonstrated leverage over thousands, not by overpowering them, but by understanding them. Fury had ignited the mission, but intellect sustained it. They left no smoking battlefield, no dramatic trophy, they left a lesson. And that lesson was heavier than wreckage. Dominance is not measured by size, it is measured by who controls tempo, who shapes perception, who forces the other side to commit first and commit wrong. When the division finally regained stable momentum, the Australians were already gone. No pursuit, no final clash. Just a quiet field and a lingering awareness that scale alone is never immunity. Sometimes the most dangerous force on the battlefield is not the one with the biggest footprint, but the one that understands exactly where that footprint is weakest. And that is how 20 men, armed with almost nothing but discipline and precision, rewrote the balance without ever needing to fire the loudest shot. In the years that followed, instructors would reduce the entire episode to a single principle. Complexity is a vulnerability when it is not consciously defended. The division's architecture had been impressive: layered command, redundant communication nets, armored mobility integrated with aerial oversight. But every layer required synchronization. Synchronization required routine. Routine required repetition. Repetition produced patterns. The Australians did not break the machine. They studied its rhythm until they could touch it at the exact points where reaction would echo the loudest. That is the difference between force and leverage. Force demands energy proportional to the target. Leverage demands precision at the right angle. The stick and string were metaphors for angle, small input, disproportionate outcome. When the division initiated its final internal review, analysts highlighted a critical error, not in tactics, but in assumption. Assumption that a smaller irregular force would seek decisive engagement. Assumption that harassment indicated weakness. Assumption that escalation would intimidate. Each assumption pushed the division to commit heavier assets into an environment designed to dissipate them. Meanwhile, the Australians operated with no assets they could not afford to lose. Freedom from dependency created strategic calm. Calm preserved clarity. Clarity preserved tempo. By the time external observers reconstructed the timeline, they noticed something striking. At no point did the 20 operators exceed their capability. They never attempted to overwhelm. They never risked exposure for symbolic victory. They stayed within margin. Large formations rarely operate within margin. They project beyond it to assert dominance. That projection became exploitable distance. When the Australians finally withdrew, they left behind more than disrupted patrol routes and overextended logistics. They left doctrine under revision. Because once a division understands it can be redirected by micro-actions, it must question every future signal. Was that stall mechanical or induced? Was that contact real or bait? Doubt introduces delay. Delay introduces vulnerability. The battlefield may reset physically, but psychologically it never returns to original configuration, and that is the final layer of this story. 20 against thousands was never about arithmetic. It was about asymmetry of thought. When one side measures strength in mass and the other measures it in understanding, the outcome is decided long before the first movement begins. The Australians did not conquer territory, they conquered tempo, and in modern conflict, tempo is territory. In the final assessment, the numbers stopped mattering entirely. 20, thousands, a stick, a string, armor, aircraft. None of it captured the core truth. The outcome was decided by who understood dependence better. The division depended on structure, layered approval, synchronized movement, and visible dominance. The Australians depended on nothing except timing, discipline, and the willingness to remain unseen. When you depend on less, you can move more freely. Freedom creates unpredictability. Unpredictability destabilizes mass. By the time the operation ended, no decisive firefight had defined it. No overwhelming strike had crushed one side. Instead, the larger force had been slowly guided into overcommitment, into fatigue, into reactive posture. And reactive posture is the quiet admission that control has shifted. The fury people talk about was real, but it was not chaos. It was focus sharpened to a needlepoint. Anger at being underestimated, anger at institutional arrogance, but anger channeled into patience, not impulse. Every piece of improvised friction had one purpose: make the division move when it did not need to, think when it could not afford to hesitate, commit when commitment offered no gain. That accumulation of micro-errors became strategic weight, and weight, once heavy enough, slows even the strongest formation. When the Australians finally disappeared beyond contact range, they left no triumphant declaration. They did not need one. The division remained intact, powerful, fully armed. But it no longer carried the illusion of automatic superiority. It had felt the pressure of being studied, predicted, redirected. That sensation does not fade easily, because once a force understands that its own doctrine can be used as leverage against it, every future engagement carries a shadow of doubt. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Scale magnifies power, but it also magnifies rigidity. Simplicity limits power, but it multiplies agility. In that imbalance lies the answer to how 20 men, armed with almost nothing tangible, could outmaneuver a formation built on overwhelming strength. They did not win by being stronger, they won by being lighter, lighter in equipment, lighter in dependency, lighter in ego, and in modern conflict the lighter force often moves first, adapts faster, and leaves before the heavier one realizes the ground has shifted. That was the real victory, not destruction, not humiliation, just a controlled demonstration that dominance belongs to the side that thinks ahead and applies pressure exactly where complexity cannot defend itself.